Welcome. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our weekly EHS Coffee and Compliance webinar, where we chat with thought leaders and regulators about emerging issues, career development, case studies, and much more. Today, we will be featuring Darrin Gamblin, an environmental attorney for Downey Brand, to chat with us about the Biden administration's impact on air compliance. Welcome.
Morning. Welcome all.
Good morning.
And so before we get started, we would like to introduce ourselves. My name is Jillian. I am the Compliance Solutions Manager here at Mathistry.
And my name's Celine. I'm the Customer Success Manager here at Mathistry. And both of us work on the customer experience team, and we work together a lot.
And then quickly, for those of you who are new to Mathistry, we'd just like to give a little rundown of what we do. We're an environmental compliance platform on the software side for industrial facilities. Mathistry focuses on providing transparency, promoting collaboration, ensuring efficiency, and finally creating accountability.
Yes. We are a data-driven platform that helps companies monitor, analyze, and track all of their environmental compliance needs in one system.
Great, and with that, we will go ahead and again, we're very excited to welcome Darrin. Little background on Darrin, he is an environmental attorney at the Downey Brand.
Before becoming an attorney, Darrin spent 15 years in the environmental compliance field, where he served as an environmental health and safety manager for manufacturing and energy facilities in California. So welcome, and with that, let's jump into some questions. So I gave you a little bit of a background, but we would love to hear more about your role, your career path, how you became an attorney, and kind of how the EHS field helped you get to where you are today.
Sure. As you mentioned, I graduated from college with an environmental science degree and worked for a series of companies in California and the Western U.S. doing EH&S, kind of a broad variety of companies, waste management, research, as you mentioned, energy, and I worked on a kind of a broad range, kind of all of your issues, as those of us who work in the EH&S field know. You kind of work on whatever issues come up. So I did a lot of air permitting, air compliance, RCRA, hazardous waste, stormwater, kind of you name it, and delve into safety every once in a while. And after doing that for a number of years, I decided that I really enjoyed reading those regulations and combing through those, and thought that, wow, I could maybe be a lawyer and do that more full time. So I did that, and I've been an attorney now for 10 years, and kind of stayed on the main part of my practice is on a similar pathway of helping companies comply with the laws, helping them out when they do have the hiccups and there's an enforcement action against them, or inspections and things, helping them navigate those and come back into compliance. And then also, litigation defense and more the other items like that, oil releases and things. So, and I've kept my focus, kept my fingers in the air world, because that's something I really enjoy doing, and kind of marries my science background and my interest in engineering and plant engineering with my career as a lawyer.
Nice. Yeah, thanks for providing that background. That sounds very cool, and I really appreciate that you have that science background as well, for environmental science, and now going into EHS, and then from there going into law. That's super interesting, and I'm sure is beneficial in many aspects for you in your job today. I do have a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it really helps me, because I've kind of been out in the field and had the boots on out in the field. So I've seen, how things work, how companies operate, and how these environmental regulations are applied out in the field, which sometimes may differ a little bit from how they're written in the rule books. So it's good to have the knowledgeable sides.
Yeah, I bet. Definitely. Yeah, I just had a follow-up with that. I know, so you mentioned that you focused on air, focused more on that aspect that you have enjoyed. Can you talk a little bit more about the air regs and kind of what aspects you have confronted, and what you like and what you don't like, and all of that?
I came at this from the kind of permitting side, or in the facilities you do the air compliance, which is typically inspections, things like that. But I really enjoyed getting kind of diving deep into the air permitting side. It's really interesting with working in California for most of my career. I deal with all of the different air agencies, which each have a different you understand air permitting. You can work in each of these agencies, but each have little different twists on the rules and different requirements. So it's always a fun and interesting challenge when you get kind of an air permitting or issue or an air compliance issue to kind of dig through the regs, understand the nuances in these, and then and you have this overarching US EPA regulatory scheme over the top of it, which you also need to understand, and maybe lots of us when we're working in the plants, we don't understand the kind of overarching EPA regulatory scheme that's over the top of all this that you also have to comply with, but sometimes you may not even realize those rules are there. So it's a fun and interesting and dynamic area, and it's also very tied to, especially in the kind of manufacturing arena, it's very much tied to the success of the company. I mean, I worked in glass manufacturing for quite a few years, and really it's you can't operate the glass plant without you're operating a huge furnace, so the air emissions and air permits are really critical to the success of the company. So it's really some high profile, high stakes kind of issues you're working on for them.
Totally. There's so much going on, and I think one thing I've learned from working at Mapestry is that regulations always change, so you have to be on top of everything, and having that knowledge and that background is super helpful, it sounds like. And with that, I kind of have another question, more general, about the environmental regulations and enforcement of the previous administration. How has that changed with the current administration? What was it like before the Biden administration, and then what do we see change?
Sure. So the past administration, I think what got most of the press was the regulatory rollbacks, and those were out there. There were a few of them, particularly on the air side. There were a few of high profile, what we could call rollbacks. The oil and gas methane rule, the Clean Power Plan rolled back. Auto GHG standards, or you could probably call them a rollback or a pause. But those got most of the press, but actually there was relatively few of those. We heard about the big issues, and there weren't a lot behind that. That was and I think that's because it takes a lot of effort at EPA and a lot of time to roll back regulations. And especially if a regulation has been on the books for a while and has been through the court system, it has been upheld by the courts, it's really difficult to just come along and for an agency to roll that back, because the courts, if they've upheld that regulation, the courts have found that it's compliant with the Clean Air Act. So now you as an agency, it's difficult to now say that this is not compliant with the Clean Air Act. We have a different regulation. So I think the kind of the rollbacks got a lot of press, but weren't really prevalent. Where the agency was more active in the last few years on kind of diverting from previous administrations were on some guidance, kind of wonky air permitting and compliance guidance memos and things that she really took a shift away and from where some of the previous administrations were. And of course, those can be passed through quite easily. I mean, they get signed by an administrator or an assistant administrator, and they show up on the website one day, and there's generally no public comment, and the courts have consistently found that they can't be challenged in court either. They're just guidance memos. So there's quite a few of those and I talked to it when I did a coffee and compliance, and at the summit last year, I talked to more in depth on some of those. Now, going forward, we don't know if those will still be there, if those, the Biden administration will probably take a hard look at a lot of the guidance and can easily pull a lot of those back without a public comment period. I went on the website, EPA's website last night, where a lot of the guidance was, and it's still there, hasn't been pulled back yet, but that may be because we don't have a new, our EPA administrator hasn't been confirmed yet, so they may be, waiting on some of these things. But I would expect there to be a lot of action on the guidance, especially that's been issued over the last 4 years. You know, some of it is you know, it's not a big departure from previous administrations, but some of them are significant departures. So I would expect those to have there'll be a really hard look at some of those, and some of those may be rescinded within the first few years of the Biden administration.
Mhm.
Kind of on the enforcement side, I've seen and read kind of different things, and it depends on the background of the you know, the author of the blog post or the article that you're writing on, what you know, what their viewpoint is. I mean, I've seen Department of Justice announced that it's enforcement activity last year, and you know, how they judged it was, you know, kind of amount of money from settlements they had, that was in line with previous years. But that's hard to go off DOJ. You know, on the environmental side, it's relatively few enforcement actions that they do, you know, compared to EPA and state level enforcement. And then some of their enforcement, it may take years to get to a settlement. So these are some things that may have started way back, you know, in a previous administration. And on the flip side, I saw an article that compared EPA's inspections. This is US EPA. Their inspections and settlements last year were at I think they said a 10-year low, but I think we all know that could be a complicating factor there that we've all been living through for the last year that may have put a damper on inspections and things like that. So, so hard to say what enforcement looked like over the last. You know, it depends which angle you want, but I expect the Biden administration, as you know, it will increase or bring back enforcement to where we saw it in previous Democratic administrations.
Gotcha. Good to know. Definitely. Yeah, that is definitely good to know. And I think that, you know, potentially, I don't know how to say, but good for our audience to know if things will go up or down, but we'll see.
Yeah.
And I mean, and I'm just talking about the kind of, you know, I mentioned DOJ and EPA enforcement. Those are the two kinds of, you know, the two levels of federal enforcement, but your states will vary, right? State and local enforcement, that's on a whole different trajectory. So you know, California enforcement has stayed very strong during the last 4 years, hasn't been affected by what, you know, federal EPA has done, because you know, states like California have very active enforcement regimes by themselves, and has seen less involvement generally from EPA than maybe other states that don't have as active an enforcement agencies. So
that's very true, and can be very impactful for a lot of companies, depending on what state they are in. Cool.
Okay, well, thank you. With that, we'll go ahead and move on to the next question or next topic, continuing on with the administration. But what are some of the action items that the current administration has already started to address with the aggressive climate initiatives that were outlined?
Sure. So that's one area where it looks like they're going to be, you know, very, very aggressive, and have actually announced a lot of specific measures that they've been working on. I guess the first, and most of this came out, was detailed in some executive orders right after I think on the day of or the day after Inauguration Day, Biden signed some of these executive orders. So under the Clean Air Act, they mentioned specifically that they would review several of the Trump climate rules, which a couple I mentioned: the oil and gas methane rule, the Clean Power Plan, and they would look at, you know, auto GHG standards. And so, you know, look at them. We're likely to see those be, you know, amended or revoked when they come around to it. But I think on the climate side, the main story was not the focus on the climate under the Clean Air Act, but kind of I think what the administration is calling this more whole government approach, to where they're looking at climate from many different angles, not just under the Clean Air Act. So we saw a lot of the announcements more kind of energy policy, you know, increase renewables. We saw that last week. We saw the repeal of the Trump administration greenhouse gas guidance for under NEPA. So that that guidance talked about, talked about looking at climate under NEPA, and that it might be too speculative. So that has been rolled back now, and we're back to kind of to the Obama era guidance, which encourages greenhouse gas and climate impacts, encourages them to be analyzed under NEPA. Then a few other ones we saw, made the news. The Biden administration paused all oil and gas leasing on federal lands. It announced that it would try and preserve 30% of the country's lands conserved by 2030. He's announced he's going back into the Paris Climate, a very broad range of climate initiatives that aren't necessarily under the kind of typical approach under the Clean Air Act. And I think it's interesting why, and in some ways it makes sense that they're moving away from the Clean Air Act. That the Clean Air Act, the latest amendments to the Clean Air Act were way back in 1990, and I think none of us were talking about climate change back in 1990 or greenhouse gases, other than probably some scientists. But it was not, it's not in the common vernacular. It wasn't really, so it wasn't baked into the Clean Air Act. So we've seen with some of these regulations, it's been a bit of a stretch to try and craft the Clean Air Act into ways to regulate greenhouse gases. It's not a really good fit on a lot of these. So a lot of the rules, when they do propose the rules and finalize them, they're really subject to a lot of legal scrutiny, and a lot of them won't hold up in the courts because they tend to be stretching and interpreting the Clean Air Act in ways that haven't been done before. So it seems that the Biden administration has learned from that and is probably going to look in other directions for for climate rules.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it seems like already there's been a lot of changes that are coming and have come already. And on the topic of the Clean Air Act, how has air compliance changed over the last 5 to 10 years? You kind of started to touch on this, but any examples, any things that have been the biggest shifts you've seen over the past couple of years?
Sure. I think that the biggest shift, and we've seen this probably more in California than in other areas, but it's also going on nationally and at other states, has been a real focus down onto individual facilities and their compliance and emissions, and kind of a transparency of that. So EPA has websites now where you can go on and see a facility's compliance record. California is working with AB 617 to increase the amount of air emissions data for stationary sources on websites, so it's easily available for community groups and environmental groups to see what your facility is doing. So it's been a real shift. I think we've seen also a fence line air emissions monitoring being installed at refineries. So communities will know right away what the actual emissions are, not what's in your permit and has been calculated what the emissions should be, but we're going to look at actual emissions and concentrations now that may be in areas instead of what the modeling shows. Mm-hmm. And then I think, as Californians, we saw last year the technology is there. During the fires last year, we all popped up these websites and saw all these air monitors in our for particulate matter in our neighborhoods. So there's a lot more of that, to where kind of emissions from individual facilities and from areas can be really pinpointed. And I think that's kind of dovetailed with something that the Biden administration has announced in several ways as a big initiative of its, and that's environmental justice. And I think we're going to see a lot of focus on that now, and what that means for folks, environmental compliance at facilities. That if your facility is located in an area with, neighbors in disadvantaged neighborhoods around you, you're going to see a lot more scrutiny, I think, both on the federal level and in California. California and AB 617 has already been identifying these communities that are disparately impacted and are socioeconomically disadvantaged. So we're going to see a lot more kind of individual scrutiny, I think, on plants, if you do happen to have a plant in these areas. And that scrutiny could lead to increased enforcement by agencies, Citizen suits are always available under the Clean Air Act. If, and now these, environmental groups or citizen groups will have access to more of your data, more of your emissions data, more of your compliance data will be right at their fingertips to guide them. And that, and that also ultimately could result in, if you're going for an expansion for your facility and need new air permits, you may have increased opposition because now you have, and your opponents will be armed with a lot more data than they have been before to help them make their case about your facility. So it's becoming probably more important than ever to maintain compliance at your facilities, because any hiccups you have are going to be a lot more visible than they were in the past to folks around you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds definitely similar to like stormwater in that sense, having a lot more of your data publicly available for people to see. And so that previously wasn't the case as far as air goes, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it wasn't as available. The data wasn't there. Just as in stormwater, the data wasn't as available, and it's becoming more. I can, pop it up on the computer now. I can, at least in California, I can pop up your stormwater compliance data right away. So
yeah, you can pull it right off the internet. That's crazy, and that must have a big impact on your clients and the people you're working with too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we definitely know how much of an impact that can have just from stormwater, at least on the steps that you need to take moving forward. And as far as compliance goes, so it sounds like similar as we mentioned for air. So there's going to be a lot more scrutiny is what you are touching on.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Good to know. Well, with that, I know we touched a little bit on greenhouse gases, and as far as the Clean Air Act, not having any changes since the 1990s. But what are some of the initiatives that the Biden administration will be taking to address greenhouse gas emissions for power plants?
So yeah, power plants are an interesting story. It goes back to the Obama administration in 2015 adopted what they called the Clean Power Plan, and this was a really a novel approach under the Clean Air Act. It was a new source performance standard, which typically only regulate a stationary source, what we call inside the fence line. So that source needs to have a control on it or something. This broadened that out and required the states to look at their whole power generation sector and meet a greenhouse gas target for that and so it went outside the fence line, and you could do it through controls inside the fence line, or you could do it more likely with, increased renewables, retiring coal plants, and opening new natural gas plants or other renewables. So that went into effect, and actually before any of the deadlines hit, the Supreme Court stayed that immediately, stayed in implementation of that. And soon after that, we're into the Trump administration, which announced a rollback, and they finally did that by 2019. They introduced the Affordable Clean Energy Act and officially repealed the Clean Power Plan. And the Affordable Clean Energy Act went back to the traditional way of looking at these new source performance standards. It focused on the power plant itself, and it just focused narrowly on coal-fired power plants and just required some heat rate improvements on these plants to make them more efficient. So that that came through, got finalized 2019, of course, was immediately challenged. And the day before the Biden inauguration, the DC Circuit overruled and threw out the Affordable Clean Energy Act, said it was too narrow, didn't regulate the source sufficiently. And also with that, it unrepealed the Clean Power Plan repeal. So that is back, but it has been kind of litigation wonk, lawyer wonk. It's been sent back to the agency to look at, so it's not back into effect yet. And actually, from what the Biden administration says, we don't expect it to be kind of reactivated. And one of the main reasons is that the goals, it set goals, the goals were set for 2030. On the Clean Power Plan, the greenhouse gas goals that be met by 2030. Well, all reports are now that most of the states have met and exceeded those goals already without the Clean Power Plan being in effect. So it's essentially, it would make no sense to re-up the Clean Power Plan because we're already there on from the power sector as far as climate goes. So It'll be interesting to see what goes on here. It's I think that we may see something like the Clean Power Plan reemerge with new goals, but also there's some doubt on that because of the Supreme Court initially staying this. There's real question about the approach that the Clean Power Plan took, this outside the fence line approach, if that would ever be approved by a court. So it'll be interesting to see which direction the Biden administration goes, but I think we will expect to see something because the power sector is, I see between, a little less than 30% of greenhouse gas emissions in the country are from the power and generation sector. So I think it's very likely we see some sort of regulation come back.
Okay. Yeah. And so with this French fence line approach, what do you see, like, if it does, get passed, what do you see coming from that? What would be the result?
So I think they need to, just the nature of, they need to be able to go outside of the fence line if they want to regulate green. And this is where I talked about, so, the Clean Air Act, it's a tough fit for climate sometimes because we don't have, unlike some other pollutants, NOx and PM, where we can capture those pollutants. It's easy to capture those pollutants inside the fence line, and we have the technologies to do really low NOx energy production or capture PM emissions. Carbon, it's not, before climate change became an issue, CO2 was not, you didn't consider that a pollutant. You considered that good combustion, right? That you're emitting CO2. That's good. That's just an outcome of combustion. So there's no, and carbon capture and storage is the one technology that would apply, but it doesn't seem to, the technology doesn't seem to be there, or it seems to be far too expensive. So the more economical way to do this is this broader based approach of increasing renewable generation around. So it'll be interesting to see how the Biden administration tries to walk that line of being able to make it a broader approach without falling afoul of the Clean Air Act.
Yeah, there's a lot to look forward to seeing changes from the Biden administration in the coming years. So definitely we'll keep our eyes peeled.
Well, we're a little short on time already, Darrin, but I just have to say thank you. It's been such a treat to have you this morning, answering all of our questions on air compliance. We have so many more for you, but thank you for elaborating on all of those topics. And it's been really insightful for not only us, but our audience as well, I'm sure. So thank you. We really appreciate your time this morning. Definitely.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity, and thanks all for listening this morning.
Yeah, thanks for joining. And then for everybody who's on the webinar, please join us next week. We'll be talking to Samir about COVID and the impact it has had on environmental compliance in the past year. It'll be a really fun and interesting conversation, so please join us. Yeah,
and if anyone on our webinar today has any questions or comments or suggestions, feedback as well, we would love. Feel free to shoot us an email at info@mapistry.com.
Awesome.
Great.
And thanks again, and happy Tuesday to everybody on the call.
Yes, happy Tuesday. We'll see you all next week.
Yeah.